how to make the matzah, and we had a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel how thick the matzah can be. Beis Shammai says you can't make a thick matzah. Beis Hillel says it's permitted. But kama pas ova, how thick is the matzah? What is the limits of Beis Hillel? Amar Rav Huna said tefach. Why a tefach? Shekei metzinu b'lechem aponim. The lechem upon the showbread that was on the table, on the shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan, that had the sides were tefach. As you know, the shape of the showbread, the thickness of the bread itself on the side walls of the bread, they made it a tefach. Now, the lechem upon also cannot be made from chametz, because we darshan kol hamincha shetakrivu, that even lechem upon cannot be made chametz. And nevertheless, in the Beis HaMikdash, they made this type of matzah, so to speak, with the thickness of the side of the lechem upon him was the thickness of a tefach. So we see it's permitted. Maskif law, Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef said, asked the question on this. Im omru b'zrizim, if they gave you a leniency to make thick matzahs by zrizim, people who are very, very diligent, kahanim who were involved in baking of the lechem upon him, they gave, because the kahanim will make sure when they bake the bread not to make it chametz. Yomru b'sheinin zrizim, will they allow this leniency to make a thick matzah by any Jew who's not so diligent? Im omru b'pas amela, if they said it by bread that's worked on, yomru b'pas she'einu amela, will they say the same idea by pas that's not worked on? In other words, the menachos, the lechem upon him, had to be all done with 300 kneads, and 500 times you have to pound it with your fist. The Gemara discusses that. So you're constantly working that. But a regular matzah, you're not working it so much. So, in other words, when you're going to make it thick, you're actually there's a potential that you're just going to leave it, and it'll come chametz. Im amru, if they gave you the leniency be'etzim yaveshin, with dry wood. In other words, in the Beis HaMikdash, they only had super dry wood. In fact, the Gemara discusses in Masechet Tainis that from the 15th and Av and onwards, they did not cut any wood for the Beis HaMikdash, because presumably at that time the sun is less strong and there's a little bit more moisture in the wood, and therefore they did not cut wood for the eitzim on the marach on the mizbeah. So they definitely used the highest quality wood possible in the Beis HaMikdash. Yomer, will they say that the eitzim lachem? Any Jew, when they're baking the bread, when they're baking matzah, they're not so particular to use the highest quality wood. They're using even wood that has moisture in it. Im amru b'tanu cham, if they gave the leniency by the hot oven. The Beis HaMikdash's oven was super hot because they were constantly baking there. Yomer b'tanu tzarnim, would we allow this to be lenient by any cold oven? When any Jew bakes his matzah, it's not an oven that's constantly in use. He has to fire it up. Perhaps he's going to put the matzah in there, the thick matzah in there, when the tanner is still a little on the cold side, and then this thick piece of dough that you want to call matzah will become chametz. Im amru b'tanu shel matechas. They gave you the leniency by the oven of metal. The ovens in the Beis HaMikdash were metal because they were used to be mekadesh the food that you're baking in it, and only kalim in the Beis HaMikdash had to be made of metal. There was no earthenware kalim in the Beis HaMikdash. So they had a metal oven. Metal oven has a very high heat potential. Yomer, would they allow anybody to make matzah b'tanur shel cheres and any tanur of earthenware? So here ends all this list of questions. The Gemara is holding by right now is that it's impossible. Beis Hillel permitted making a matzah very thick, even the thickness of a tefach. That permission was only granted in the Beis HaMikdash, but not anywhere else. And that's why today I don't think anybody makes a thick matzah. Although I'm told that Moroccan Jews maybe have a thick matzah. But
the Sephardim supposedly the joke is that it's like chametz. I remember when I was in yeshiva, we had a Sephardi guy, and like, oh, you're gonna go home and eat your pizza dough on Pesach. It's a thicker, but
like
in
a
their
lafo.
circle, it's okay.
It's like
almost like a lafa, yeah.
Like
but in their according to their halacha, it's okay.
what you see in our Gemara is the Gemara like was so shocked that there could be a possibility of making a thick matzah that the Gemara has to now reinterpret the whole thing and say it's impossible. Right. So what does it mean? Pas ava in the Mishnah. Here it says Beisila permits a pas ava, a thick matzah. So that's why you're learning the Gemara that they're gonna. It's such a chiddush of how to learn pshat in that brisa. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, she'iltis es Rabbi b'yichud. I asked my Rebbe in total privacy and clarity. I wanted to get it clear. Umani, who is my rabbi? Rav. Rav explained me this brisa. Ika de Amari, others say, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said in the Rav, name of Rav, that they also were troubled by this brisa. And they asked She'ilis as Rabbi Yichud b'Yichud. And I asked my Rebbe in total privacy and clarity, Umani, who is my Rabbi? Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So they asking him, please explain the brisa when it says that you can make a thick matzah. So he says, my pas ava. What does brisa mean, a thick matzah? Pas meruba. It means a lot of dough. In other words, you're baking a bunch of matzah on Yom Tov. That's what it means. You're making, let's say you're baking a matzahs on Pesach. Yom Tov, you know you're allowed to bake. Don't do too much because you're doing a tirchi yisera and it's not necessary. You're not allowed to do an extra, you're allowed to bake for yourself if you're going to eat it. But to make so much that you're not going to finish it in Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do. Beis Hillel says it's permitted. Beis Hillel says it's permitted because the bread comes out, the matzah will come out better if you make the oven full with a lot of matzahs. But Beis Shammai says no. It really has nothing to do with chametz and matzah. You're making thin matzahs, but the word pas ava doesn't mean thick. It means in quantity, a lot of matzahs. That's why they had to. That's why these Moroim had to tell you, I'm saying it in the name of so and so, the great gadol, because they're really taking it the word ava out of its usual meaning. The word ava usually means thick, but here it means meruba in quantity. And the Gemara asks, "Mamai korelei pas ava? Why would you call it thick matzah? A thick? I mean, you mean quantity. Mishum denefisha belisha, because there's a lot that you're kneading together at the same time, and that's why it's called ava. You're kneading a lot. The Iba is saying, if you want, I can tell you, the Asrei, the high Tana, in the city of the Tana that wrote down that brisa, the pas meruba, when they want to say somebody's making a lot of matzahs, pas ava korele. They're saying it. He uses the word ava, that they're making a lot of thick batter or whatever you want to call it. But really, it's a quantity. And the Gemara explains, my Tama, why can't they make a lot of matzahs on Yom Tov? Because you're doing something unnecessary on Yom Tov. So the Gemara asks, my year Pesach, every Yom Tov, I feel it be Yom Tov Name. Every Yom Tov, you should not be allowed to, let's say on Sukkot, you can't make a dozen cakes on Sukkot if you're not going to eat it on that day. So why does the example that the Tana uses have to do with Pesach? It has nothing to do with Pesach. He says the Gemara, true, that's right. But Hai Tana b'Yontav shel Pesach koi. He was writing this brisa near the Yontav of Pesach, so he uses the example on an example of baking on Pesach matzahs. But really, he could have wrote this story by any other Yontav, by Sukkot, by Shavuos. Tanya Nami Hachi, we learned in another brisa. Beis Shammai says, Ein oifim pas ova. One is not allowed to, here, I'm sorry, it's a mistake. Ein oifim pas meruba. So here, if you see on the side, it says meruba. You're not allowed to bake pas meruba b'yantiv, Beis Hillel matim. So you see, it has nothing to do with the thickness of the matzah. It has to do with the quantity of the matzah. And yet Beis Hillel says it's permitted because even if you're making a large quantity that you're not going to use on that day, but the matzah comes out better if there's a lot of matzahs in the oven. Interesting. Tanu Rabbanim. Yoitzin bepas. Now the Gemara talks about the shape of the matzah. Yoitzin bepas nakia. One is permitted. Your yoitza having very clean, clean matzah. In other words, the flour is very sifted. And it's not a problem. Why shouldn't I be yaitza? Like you might think it's too rich, too fine. If you have a super AAA quality matzah, maybe that doesn't qualify for lechem oni. It's not so poor. It's so it costs you $60 a pound. So the Gemara says the yaitza. The Brisa says yaitza. And even the hadra'ah, if you have a coarse flour that you didn't sift it, right? You're also yaitza with that kind of matzah, even though it might be too poor, not a hider mitzvah. Uvasrikin, hamutzuyorin. Here is the shape matzah. Let's say you make the shape of the matzah like a boat, okay? You form a shape of the matzah. The Pesach, you're yaitza. But nevertheless, afal pisha amru ein oisin surikin hamutzuyorin b'Pesach. You're not supposed to make a matzah into a shape. You make it round and be done with it, but not supposed to make it a shape. And the reason the Gemara is going to explain is because when you make it into a shape, there's a good chance that you're just going to leave it unmoved because you're so busy trying to shape it that you're going to leave it there and it's going to become chametz. So you want to make the matzah as quickly as possible. That's why we don't have matzahs with shapes on them. Now, Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, I want to adava zeh shol Baisus ben Zunin. Baisus ben Zunin asked the Chachamim, Mipnei ma Amru, why did the Chachamim say ain't oisin srikin b'tzuyam b'Pesach? You're not allowed to make a matzah in any shape. Amru lai, so they told him Mipnei sheisha shoya aleh, because the woman that's making the matzah into a shape ulma chamatzta, and will make it chametz because she's trying to shape it. I guess everybody had their own matzah bakery in their own home. So if the woman's making it and you tell her that you can make it into a shape, she's going to keep it around and it'll become chametz. So this is what Ben Baisus, look at closely, Baisus asked the Chachamim. Amar lahem, so he challenged the Chachamim's ruling. Afshe yasenu kibet fuz v'yik be'eno kivam. A person, you can actually have a form, right, that easily shapes the matzah and it could go very quickly. So why do you say you can't do it across the board? I have a certain form, right? And I can, shape the matzah very quickly. And so why can't I do it? Amru Loi, they told him, no. Yomru, they will say, Kol asrikin asukin. Everybody's going to say, every shape is asur, usriki baisus mutarin. And the shape of baisus, the shapes that baisus, his matzah is, the shape matzah of baisus, that's mutar. In other words, this is a lesson how Chazal made across the board. When the Chazal made a gzeira and said you should not do something, they didn't give you exceptions to that ruling. And you can see over here, I don't know if you're familiar who this baisus was, but I think, you know who baisus was? Anybody? The Gemara says,
Baisusim, no?
Right. That's right. Antigonus had two Talmidim, they Tzedukis and Baisusim. And they always challenged the Chachamim, and they reverted back to biblical law because they couldn't understand these Gezeras, and every Gezeras has an exception. So he wanted to make exception, and they told him, if you start making exception, nobody's going to be listening to the rule itself. So there are no exceptions. A funny name, Baisus ben Zoinin. Baisus, the son of Harlots. Anyway, very interesting. So now it's interesting. Amar Rab Loza bar Rab Tzadok. So Rab Loza, son of Tzadok, said, "Pamachas nichnasni achar abba lebeis Rabbi Gamliel." I followed my dad into the house of Rabbi Gamliel. Okay, they vilafonov, and in the house of Rabbi Gamliel, they brought before him srikin hamitzuyar Pesach. They brought these matzahs that had a shape on them on Pesach, right? So Amarti, I said to my father, now you don't tell your father, you're doing wrong, don't eat it. I think a kid comes home from Israel, he's right away telling his father, we're doing everything wrong here. He said, Abba. He said, my father, Loi kachamar mechamen, didn't Chachamim say something like, Ein oisen srikin hamitzuyar Pesach, that you're not allowed to make these type of shapely matzahs? So how could Rabbi Gamliel serve it? So Amalei, so my father told me, and his father's name is Reb Tzadok, he said, Bini, my son, it's not every person that's not allowed to make the matzahs this way. The nachtoimim, the bakers, a professional baker, he's not allowed to make a matzah that has a shape on it, because most nachtoimim that are trying to sell are very careful about the shape and they want to make it to perfection. and they're going to make it, they're going to delay it and make it, and the matzah will become chametz. Some say this is what he meant to say. He said any person, not that the nachtoim who's a professional, he could actually put everything in a form, in a shape very quickly. But the isser of making shapely matzahs is for everybody. Everybody's not allowed to make the shapely matzahs because not everybody's as expert and dexterous as a baker. So therefore, it was also for him. Amar Rabbi Yossi said, "Oisin srikin kamin rekikin." You're allowed to make shapes if it's a thin matzah. Then oisin srikin, you can't make a shape. It's kamin geluska ois. If it's a thick matzah, if it's like a little bit thicker, like cakey, then you can't make a. So he was more compromised. The general thing is we don't make any design on a matzah, and the perforations that we do on a matzah are to help the matzah so it doesn't become chametz, but not because of any time it was designed. Okay, new Gemara. Tana Rabbanim. Hasuf ganin, v'haduf shanin. Hasuf ganin is a spongy type of. Now here we're going into the mitzvah of challah. Okay, you're making a dough. Hasuf ganin, a spongy dough. V'haduf shanim, and a dough that's fried in honey. The keritin is like a loose batter that's also fried in honey. It's fried, and I'm trying to tell you that they're not going to bake it; they're going to fry this type of dough. But chalas hamasreis, and chalas hamasreis is the we'll see what that is, but that's you're cooking it actually. You're scalding it. You're scalding the chalas hamasreis is that you're scalding it. You're cooking it over a flame. You're not baking the dough. The hamaduma and duma is a dough that's mixed with truma. Okay, so the Gemara they give you 4 or 5 examples over here. All these things patur min challah. If you make a dough like that, you put the challah. Let's get to explain. If something is meduma, if it's mixture of truma and regular tevel, it's potter from challah because anyway, it's the Torah says you give a piece of challah to the kohen and the rest is permitted to a Jew. But here, if it's mixed up in the beginning, right? So therefore, it's already by separating it, you still can't. The remaining cannot be eaten by a regular Yisrael. That's why it's potter from the challah. But we're going to focus on the other 4: 1, sufganim, duvshanim, esrikidim, chalas misris, chalas hamasris. Why they potter? So my chalas hamasris. What is a challah? A dough that's cooked in a pot. Amar Rav Yeshua Levi zecholut bale batem. That Rav Yeshua Levi explains it was scalded. You're putting it into hot water. The word bale batem refers to wealthy people. You never hear in shidduchim when they say somebody. They don't want to say he's wealthy. They say he's balabatish. So that all over in Truma and Masechta Challah, when they say balabatim, it refers to rich people. They used to put their dough in hot water prior to them baking it. So, or bake it that way. So Amar Rash Lakish explained even further. Haloli maise ilpasein. They are instead of baking it in an oven, you're cooking the dough and making a cake over the flame in a pot. Ilpas is a pot. So, and therefore, since you're not baking the dough in a normal oven, that's why it's potter from challah. Challah is something that you make a dough, which is about 3 or 4 pounds, and then you bake it into the oven. So if your intention is to make bread out of it, then it's chayiv and challah. But since you're putting it over the flame in a pot in a boiling water, you're cooking it. That's why Rish Lakish says that's what the brisa means to say you're potter from challah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Maisi Ilpa is chayavin. If you really make it in a pot and you cook the dough, it's chayav and challah. It's regular bread. So what's the problem with all these things? In all these cases, you actually cooked it in the sun. If you cook it in the sun, then it's not bread, and then it's potter from challah. So the Brisa asks a question against Rish Lakish. The Brisa says, Hasuf ganim, baduvshanim, ve'eskrikitin, asa'on be'ilpis, if you make it over in a pot, chayovin, it's chayiv. Bechama, If you make it in the sun, peturim. So you see, if you make it in a pot, it's chayiv in challah. So the Brisa says explicitly that a pot makes it bread. It's only if you make it in the sun, it's peturim. Yofti the Rav Shimon Mishlakis, is it a knockout blow against Rav Shimon Mishlakis? That Brisa is talking about shehir tiach ul b'soif hidbek. In other words, when is it similar that Yitzchayovim is if you heated up the pot and then you pasted the dough into the pot, right? Right? I guess normally, I don't know if here's a picture of an oven, of an ancient oven, right? You stuck the dough on it. So instead of using an oven, an ancient oven, you use the pot and you heated up the pot underneath the flame. And then you stuck the dough on the side walls of this pot, so to speak. Then that's similar to an oven. And then even Rish Lakish says that's chayovin. Aval hidbik. So the Gemara asks the question now. Aval hidbik. But if you stick the dough in first and then heat up the pot, that's when the previous brisa says, you potter. My hochinami de peturim. So the way you interpreted the first brisa, it means you potter. So then, why does the second brisa run to another case? Ad Tani Sefer. Why does the second brisa say ason b'chama? If you make it in the sun, peturin, right? Liflek v'lisnibid today. It can make a differentiation in the first case. That means in the pot itself. When is it chayev? There sometimes you'll be potter. But medvamamun could going, for example, if you heat up the pot first. And then you paste the dough on the side, that's when it's chayav. Aval hidbik, if you paste first, and then you heat up the pot, peturin, it would be pater. So why does the brisa, if that's the case, if you're correct, Rish Lakish, then why does the second brisa that says asam bilpes chayavim jump to another case? If you make it in the sun, it's peturin. There's a way that you're making it in a pot, it will also be pater and challah. So the Gemara says, Shlaka's answers, there's something missing in this brisa. If you heat up the sides, then you paste the dough. But if you if you paste it, and then you heat it up, that's as if you made it in the sun. Upaturin, it's potter. So that's how Rish Lakish will answer that brisa, that it's not difficult against him. Toshima, come in here. This is another question against Rish Lakish. Yoitzim b'matzah your yoitza with matzah that was semi-baked. In other words, they didn't leave in the oven so long, right? I guess some matzah companies, if they're too busy, you're getting half-baked matzahs. Matzah asuya be'ilpas, even with matzah that was made in a pot. So we see your yoitza with a matzah that was made in a pot. After the Gemara, Hachinami, Rish Lakish will tell you that's talking about a pot. Shehir tiach. You warmed up the pot, and then you pasted the dough on the side. The Gemara just asks, "My matzahina." What does it mean, a matzah that's not fully baked? If you would take it apart, and you don't see strings. When you take it apart, you don't see strings extending from it. That's called it's baked enough, and you could be yaitza with it on Pesach. Rava said, "V'chein lachmei toda." The lachmei toda, the breads of the toda offering, also you had to bake bread, and that was matzah bread. And that matzah bread, if it was baked even halfway, it has a kedusha on it when you shech the carbon toida. Because when you shech the carbon toida, it wasn't baked at all, or it was not even halfway baked, then it wouldn't become kaddish. So Rava says that by lachmei toida, if it's even partially baked, even if you didn't fully bake it, as lachmei toida, it still will have a kedusha on it, as long as when you break it apart, you don't see strings coming out of it. So the Gemara asked, Pshita, what is Rava teaching me? Hocha lechem ksiv, hocha lechem ksiv. It says lechem by of course, by chametz. Shiva talks about matzah as being lechem. And lechem, it also says, by lachmei toida, it also says that it has to be lechem. So what's the chiddush of Rahel? So the Gemara says, Ma'u the same. I would have thought by lachmei toida it's different. Hoyel ksiv, since it says a pasuk, v'kriv mimenu, we go to Lamed Zayin Beis, echon mikol karban. that the matzah has to be one of each of those matzahs you give to the kohen when you bring your toida, and that's a gift to the kohen. And the Torah says echad, it has to be one piece. Echad shleitul paris. You can't give the kohen a partial matzah. You have to give him a whole matzah. V'hachan, I would think that if you bake it so halfway baked, command the priesthood, we count it as if it's broken already. Kamash malon, not. If it's halfway baked, and when you break it apart, there are no strings attached. That's the way to remember it. Then it's still kosher. I don't know if you have experienced baking matzah, but if you go to a matzah bakery, you'll know what they're talking about. That sometimes the baker by accident takes a matzah out too early, and when you break it apart, you could still see some dough. It wasn't baked at all. Basically, this is a question against Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rabbi Yochanan holds that if it's baked in a pot, it has a din of matzah or challah, and therefore it's chayev and challah. So the Brisa says hama'isa, something's made like a hama'isa, beishamei poitrim beis hillel mechayvim. Fine. We don't know what this word me'isa means. Hachalita, it's the opposite. Beishamei says it's chayev and challah, or beis hillel says poitrim. So now the Brisa defines eizehu me'isa be'ezehu hachalita. What is me'isa and what is chalita? So the answer is hama'isa, a dough that's called me'isa, is before you put it into the oven. Prior to making the dough, you put kamach shal gabe muglashin. You put flour right on top of hot water, and then you make the dough. And then after making dough, you bake it. Hachalita, what's hachalita? If it's the opposite, muglashin. First put the hot water in. You first put the kamach in the bowl, and then you put the hot water on top. Muglashin shal gabe akeva. So we don't really know what would be the difference. Why in one case Beishamai would be pointed by the Isa, and then by Chaliti he would be Chayev, and Beis Hillel would do the opposite. Nevertheless, the Brisa continues. Rabbi Shmuel Barab Yosi Omer Mishum Aviv Zev Ezel P'tur. Zev Ezel means that to them Isa and Chalita are potter from Chala. But Army Law and others say Zev Ezel Chiyuv. They're both Chayev and Chala. Both Beishamai and Beis Hillel say it's Chayev and Chala. But Chachamim say Echad Zeh, the Echad Zeh. Both Meisa and Glisa, if you bake it, it's fine. But Asan be'ilpas, but if you put it in a pot and bake it, potter, it's potter from Chana, but Tanner, but if you put it afterwards in the oven, Chayiv, it's Chayiv and Chala. So right away, the Chachamim, you see, if you make a dough and you don't ever put it in the oven, you just put it in a pot, you potter. So now, the Bryce, right now, the Gemara could have asked the question against Rabbi Yochanan, but usually we do housekeeping, in other words, to prove that this Brisa is not a mistake in Brisa. So the Tanakama, Maishna Me'isa, Maishna Chalita. Why does the Brisa say that Beishamai says Me'isa Potter and Beis Hillel is Chayev, and Chalita is Chayev and Beis Hillel says Potter? Me'isa and Chalita are basically the same thing. Flour with hot water, you're just changing the order. So why should there be a difference? Why one way Beishamai is Machmir and one way he's Mekel? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, but Tavra, you break it. In other words, it's a mistake, this Brisa, but really what it means to say is Hama'isa and Hachalita, and we're not sure. Beishamai, one Tana said Beishamai was the lenient one, and Beis Hillel was the stringent one. And one Monday Amar said Beishamai was the lenient, and Beis Hillel was the stringent. But it's not that you separate them. Actually, it's written by two different authors, and one used the word Me'isa and one used the word Chalita, but it doesn't matter the order. The bottom line is you're using hot water over here. Either Beishamai will hold it's Chayiv and Chala, or Potter and Chala, or the reverse of Tilla. Here's the question. The question that we brought this Brisa is, it's a question against Shlokas. Katanomius, it just nevertheless says, if you make a dough in a pot, it's potter. The Tanner Chayiv, if you put the bread in the oven, then it's Chayiv. To Yofta Rabbi Yochanan, it's not a blow against Rabbi Yochanan. It's a machlekes tanoim. If you make a bread over the pot, it's a machlekes tanoim. The Tanya we learned in a brisa. The Tanakama says, I might think mu'usa and mechaluta would be chayim and chalmo. Talmud loyma lechem, bread. Now, why shouldn't it be chayim and chala? it's you end up putting it in the oven. And Rabbi Yehuda, ein lechem elo ofi b'taner. The bread is only if you put it in a tanner. So what is this machlekes all about? Rabbi Yehuda hainin Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda is saying the same thing as the Tanakama. Elalav ma'ase ilpis ika benayo. The ma'ase ilpis ika benayo. What is a ma'ase ilpis? Tanakama sava ma'ase ilpis chayovin. If it's cooked in a pot, yes, it would be chayiv in chala. The Rabbi Yehuda sava ma'ase ilpis beturim. And by Yisi Ilpis, if it's made in a pot, it's potter. In other words, this is what the Tanakama says. These are not bread because before you need them, if you just cook them in hot water, then it's nothing. But if you end up putting it in a pot, right, it looks like an oven, that will be good enough according to the Tanakama. But according to the Rabbi Yehuda, even if you put it in a pot of boiling water, even after you put it in a boil, but if you put it in a pot and you're making it in a pot, underneath a pot is the flame, that would be potter, and that would not be chayev and chal. It's not called bread. And then Rabbi Yochanan held like the Tanakama, if you make it in a pot, it's good. So the Gemara says maybe that's not a machlekes tanoim. Loi, the kulli alma, everybody can hold ma'isi ilpes beturim. It's possible to learn shot in that brisa that everybody holds that if it's made in a pot, it's potter. It's not called bread if it's made in a pot. Over here, they're arguing you put hot water on it, you cooked it first, and then you eventually put it into an oven again, like the ancient way to make bagels. I think what they used to take is the dough and drop it into hot water, maybe bake it, maybe cook it that way, and then bake it in the oven. So since it's eventually baked in an oven, the Tana Kamas of it came in Shechazav Afoy Betana. Since you corrected it and took it out of the hot water and baked it into an oven, Lechem Karina Bay. That's called Lechem, bread. Rabbi Yehuda Sava, Rabbi Yehuda holds, Ein Lechem El Ofi Tami Kara. Bread is only if it's put into an oven with no stopovers, not stopped over, cooking it first and then putting it in an oven. Bread is only if it's cooked in an oven. The kiva, the bikara la betar. Since this case was never cooked in an oven, lav lechem hu, it's not bread. Bread is only if the only method of making it become bread was by an oven. That's the only way it could become bread. Amar Rava my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. What is the reason Rabbi Yehuda? The ksiv, we have a pasuk it says by the toichacha, by the rebuke, the punishments if we don't listen to mitzvahs. That Hashem says it will be such hunger that 10 women will bake their breads in one tanner. Now the word echad is extra because it could have said there'll be such a shortage of firewood, they'll all need to bake their bread in an oven. Oven is singular. Echad is extra, one oven. Oven is singular. By saying one oven, it's teaching you a din somewhere else. Lechem, bread, ha'afu b'tanur echad. Bread that's made only using one mechanism called an oven, karu lechem. That's called bread. V'she'ein afu b'tanur echad, but something that's not made with only the oven, but you're cooking it first and then baking it, ein karu lechem, that's not called bread. Okay, one more piece of Gemara. I just point out to you that bagels are not fully cooked when they used to drop it in hot water. So what Rabbi Yehuda is referring to, if you actually totally cook the bread and then bake it, that's not called lechem.
Bernard, I could interrupt. Actually, my grandfather owned a bagel bakery, and I worked in one. So the way they do it is because they put it in the retarder, the dough, so it doesn't rise. And then they throw it into a kettle, a boiling kettle, and then it becomes nice and puffy, and you put it into the oven. That's how bagel. Until today, that's how they do it.
I thought they steam it today. No, they steam it.
I'm pretty sure they put it in a giant kettle, and it goes and because it's otherwise it rises up. They put it in the retarder. It's cold. You throw it into the kettle. It puffs up, and then you throw it into a very large oven, and it bakes it. I'm pretty sure. At least I know a couple of places that still do that. They may steam it in other places.
They have both ways, but they still do it with water also.
Right.
Yeah, wow. They kettle it.
Okay, so either way, it definitely should get that on Moitzi. Sheldon,
Yeah.
you would have done great if you stayed in that bagel business. They seem
I would have made. Yeah, my uncle said I would have made a lot of dough. That's what they
yeah,
said. She said.
right. This Tani's for a
Yeah.
little egg salad, he's charging $9.
Yeah. That's what my uncle said. Yeah.
Okay, one more piece. I just point out that just that the last thing I want to tell you is that we have the donuts. The donuts in general is one of those things. We just learned that Rabbi Yochanan said that if you just make it on a pot, it's chayev and challah. So basically, if you a deep fryer is like making making something on a pot, and yet the donuts is one of those things that is chayev and challah because we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. But our custom is to make mazonas on it because it's not baked in an oven at all. And so therefore, it says in Shulchan Aruch that if someone eats donuts, a Yiras Shamayim would, because it's a whole suffix whether you should even wash on donuts, because at the end of the day, it should be like bread. So what they do is they tell somebody to wash on hamotzi, regular bread, and eat the donuts in the middle of the meal. I mean, that's if you want to be very strict about it. But because it's only baked on a deep fryer, does not get a hamotzi. One last piece, Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef was sitting achorei de Rab Zera, in the back of Rab Zera. In other words, Rab Zera had the front row seat. The Yosef Rab Zera kamei de Ula, and Rab Zera was sitting in front of the lecturer Ula. Amalei Rabbi Rab Zera. So Rabbi whispered to Rab Zera, asked from Ula, basically you're making a dough in a pot and you're putting the dough first and then you're lighting the fire underneath the pot. So Rab Zera says, why should I ask him that? That is my seilpus. Amalei, my emelach. What do you think he's going to tell you? The Amin Alei, if I ask him this question, Amalei, he'll tell me, hey, my seilpus. That's called cooking it in a pot. That's not an oven. The oven is where the fire is very close to the bread. Here, the fire is on the outside of the vessel. So that's what the whole discussion of this whole sugya. Amalei Rav Yosef Rav Zera. So Rav Yosef said to Rav Zera, ask him another question. Here is a little different. You put the dough inside the pot, but instead of putting the fire underneath the pot, you put the fire on top. Somehow you had a fire on top of it. And the reason why they put the fire on top of it is because it should go directly onto the bread that's inside the pot. And
like how we broil. That's right. We do in a broiler.
Oh, very good. Exactly. And therefore, at the end of the day, there's one problem. It's very similar to an oven, to an ancient oven, because the fire is there close. But at the end of the day, it's in a pot, not in an oven. So, and therefore, Amalei, he was my Amalei. What do you think he's going to answer you? In other words, Rab Zera did not want to ask Ula the question when you know the answer. Don't bother the rabbi if you know the answer. The Aminalei, if I'm going to ask him this question, Amalei, he's going to tell me, Roiv Aniyim Oisim came. That's the way poor people make their bread in a pot. And because they want to save on fuel, so they make the fire directly on top so it bakes quickly. And therefore, it's probably considered, Rashi says, it's considered Maisi Ilpis. It's still in a pot. Roiv Aniyim called Maisi Ilpis Kain Shein Lam Eitzim. For those that can't afford so much wood, that's the way they make their Maisi Ilpis. But it's still considered cooked in a pot, and therefore it would be subject to the Machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish if it's Chayev and Chala or not. So we'll stop over here on Daf Lamed Zayin Lamed Beis. Okay. Okay, very good. That's what I told you. It's about Hilchas Brachas, Hilchas Chala. Interesting. Okay, take care. Good night.